McMaster. I'm president of the OPSU Greater Toronto Area Council, and I'm a member of the GTWA Labour Committee. I'd like to take this opportunity. Can't hear me? Okay. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers for their valuable contribution to the discussion and to all of you for coming here to add to the debate. A year ago, I had a conversation with a really politically astute, longtime union activist friend, and he said to me, "Right to work won't happen here for another 10 years." And I said, that's what they were saying in Detroit a month ago. There's been a legitimate, long-time debate on the left about the value of the RAND formula and automatic dues checkoff, but it's clear that right here, right now, we're not talking about the best-case scenario where we make our own decisions. We're facing an organized, concerted attack on one of the few organizations left where working people still have the resources to fight back against neoliberalism. We're here tonight to hear about what the consequences can be for all working people inside and outside the labor movement, what it will take to fight back, and what kind of change we need to effect to get there. So to focus our thinking, we've gathered together three excellent speakers tonight to address the impact of right to work. Please join me in welcoming John Cartwright. John is the president of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, where the council has recently led workshops on right to work with, is it 1,200 members?
720 the first time, 120 next.
So almost 1,000 members across Toronto and York regions.
So good evening, sisters and brothers. I've distributed Labour Council's summer newsletter because I'm going to refer to some articles that are in there that people may not be familiar with some of the process of our efforts and the feedback we've been getting from union members. I mean, most people in this audience don't need to have described the fact that there's a struggle going on, that the business and global capital has declared war on the working class, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to just review quickly a framework. The Labour Council has been around since 1871. That's 142 years of a cohesive, organized working class representation. There were unions before then. The typographical union goes back to the 1840s. There are others that came and went. We had the Knights of Labour here for a period of time. But as a cohesive, organized family of unions, we've been around for 142 years. And our movement in Toronto and across this country and in the world, we say does two kinds of bargaining. In our workplace with our employers, we do collective bargaining. With those in power in our society, we do political bargaining. And the forms of that political bargain have taken many, many different kinds of forms. And much of what we talk about as the social wage that the working class has today in Canada, healthcare, decent childcare, unemployment insurance, affordable housing, all of those kinds of things are part of a social wage that have been run through political bargaining, including the Employment Standards Act and the minimum wage as it exists for everybody. The collective forms of representation that working people have developed in this city, Canada's largest urban centre, and in the last 2 centuries, have many different forms. The labour movement is the most essential form for working people, but other important forms of collective representation have to be factored into our discussion tonight. And those forms of collective representation included things like the anti-racist movement, the women's movement, the LGBT movement, other movements around equity. At one point, the tenants movement was a powerful movement in this city. There are others that have been come and gone in terms of forms of collective representation where ordinary people who by themselves are powerless have been able to influence outcomes of political events. Yesterday we witnessed the anniversary of the first 9/11, 1973, the Pinochet coup, which, as many historians will say, ushered in the new era of neoliberalism, the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein writes about so eloquently. And that decision by significant sections of capital to say the social contract that we had to give up after the Second World War, that's done. We're going to start rolling back as much as we can. We're going to attack workers' rights. We're going to privatize. We're going to undo many of those advances. And we've been seeing the effects of shock doctrine ever since. I think it's worthwhile remembering that our own homegrown shock doctrine was a guy called Mike Harris in 1995. And that in fact, the labor movement and the popular movement in this province rose to the occasion. And nothing got rolled over under Mike Harris. Think of it. We stopped privatization of hydro. He wanted to privatize hydro. We stopped the privatization of water. He wanted to decimate OPSEU as a union, and that was stopped. He wanted to attack basic workers' rights in place after place after place. And although he changed the law, the resistance was formidable. It was split later on. And we have some, bad stories to tell over a few beer. But it's important to recognize that if we had not developed such a strenuous resistance, the right and capital in this province, in this country, would have been much further ahead with the imposition of shock doctrine than they are today. It's also worthwhile noting that Harris is the person we love to hate, but under the McGuinty Liberals, there has been more privatization of transit than Harris ever dreamed of. There's been more privatization of electricity generation than Harris ever dreamed of. And that Bill 115 affecting education workers actually was, in many elements, a greater threat to basic labor rights than much of the legislation that Mike Harris rammed through. So there's a context here to think about where we're at. Tracy mentioned Michigan. I think, like many of us, we thought, boy, that's terrible stuff going on in the States. The Tea Party, those 11 Republican governors that were elected, that immediately brought in a whole sweep of anti-union legislation. But that's all south of the border. And, we always make excuses for our good sisters and brothers south of the border and think, at least we've got something different here. Well, Michigan sent an alarm bell ringing through the entire labor movement in Canada, the home of industrial unionism, the Flint sit-down strike in the 30s. All of a sudden, in 7 days, that legislation, that they call right-to-work legislation, ushered through all three levels and signed into law. Our largest trading partner. And together with Indiana, very, very important places that companies here can relocate to very easily and serve exactly the same markets. So we immediately talked to our American colleagues and said, what the hell happened? Tell us what that's about. Tell us what your learnings are from fighting this kind of offensive for the last 50 years, since the Right to Work Foundation was originally founded. And what do we need to think about as we start getting ourselves ready for this tidal wave coming across the border? Because Tim Hudak had promised it in his white paper. Stephen Harper was moving Bill 377 forward, and we understood there were going to be more private members' bills along those lines. And our friends in ASME, who came up here to do the showing of the film Wisconsin, We Are Wisconsin, the premier was here in Canada, and our Labor Council had a special labor night with all of the key colleagues that came up from the states around that. Our friends and the teachers who put in tremendous battle in the state of Ohio to actually have that legislation undone by referendum. They gave us some good advice. They said, start talking now, ring the alarm bells and challenge denial. Oh, and by the way, if the phrase right to work is not hardwired in Canadian vocabulary, never use the friggin' phrase. It's our enemy's language. Never give our enemies the ground to start from. And so you will see in the Labor Council material that we never use that phrase except in quotation marks. And when we're talking about that, it's always anti-union legislation, free rider legislation, and the issue is about defending workers' rights. And I think that's very good advice. And I'd pass that on to everybody in this room and everybody else in their practice. Because in the States, they know what that means. When we say to ordinary workers the word right to work, we have to explain it to 8 out of 10 of them. So why would we give our opponents that advantage of using that phrase at all? So the question is, what do we do? And I think there's 3 key pillars of our response as a working class, as a people of Toronto, of Ontario, of Canada. The first one is we have to have a plan. And that plan has to be carefully thought through. It has to have an analysis, a class analysis of what's happening here. It's not just Tim Hudak because he's a mean SOB. It's not just the Conservative Party. It comes from deeply seated instincts of some of the most reactionary sections of capital. In Canada, people may or may not know, but the primary lobby group for this stuff is not just the Fraser Institute, but Merit Canada. Merit Canada is a group of construction contractors out of Alberta and BC that are the creature of the oil industry. Much like the Koch brothers are the main drivers of some of this really reactionary stuff in the States, and of course the oil industry across the world is part of the petro-state erosion of democracy. There's a connection. So if Tim Hudak was hit by lightning tomorrow, these guys and the oil people behind them would continue to move this agenda forward. There has to be a strong class analysis of who's on our side and who's on the other side. There has to be a plan that is completely rooted in equity. An equity lens, an equity agenda, an equity commitment. Listen, half of us were born outside of Canada. Half of us are people of color in this city. You can't have any kind of plan that doesn't start with equity and have a complete commitment to diversity and anti-racist practice. And the third piece is we've got to look honestly at the strengths and weaknesses of our movement. Who's there today? Who's not there? And if I have time, I'm going to talk about how big the working class is in Toronto in terms of sector by sector by sector. And sisters and brothers, it's daunting when you think about the raw numbers that are out there and what we need to do in terms of communication and conversation. The second part is that communication and conversation, membership engagement. The fact is most of our unions, because we do have RAND formula, because we do have automatic checkoff, there's none of our unions that I know of other than maybe the postal workers trying to do the bike courier organizing, where any union rep today has to walk around the shop floor or the office or the hospital or the store and say, give me union dues and this is why it's worth it. We get the check from the employer every month. And most of our unions, if you actually say how much time you spend talking to your members, the reality is when you scratch the surface, very few talk to a majority of members once a year. Have a picnic, they have a party, there's nice turnout at Labor Day. Most don't. The polling that the CLC did was very instructive. More than 2/3 of union members say it's the union. Only less than a third say it's my union. And there's a huge difference in sense of ownership between unions where you join, like my union, the Carpenters, where you actually join that union, and it provides a hiring hall process, and unions like IATSE and some of those others, ACTRA and others, there's a huge difference between that engagement and public sector unions and industrial unions where you get a job and there's a union card with it, and somebody 3 generations ago won union status for you, but you got the card. Huge difference in that reality. So how do we undertake a conversation with 500,000 workers in Greater Toronto? That's how many union members there are in the GTA. How do we take that conversation with 3 million workers across Canada? That's the challenge in front of us, and it ain't easy, and it's not about preaching. The CLC is now starting to roll out their process, and they have a nice slogan that I think is very effective. And the slogan is go, listen, build. The big part is listening. It's not unnatural for many of us in the left or many of us in the labor movement. A lot of us think we got it, and we're just going to explain it. And if you don't understand it the first time, we'll talk louder and explain it more. Listening to people's lived experience and respecting that lived experience, and then trying to understand what the union has to do to connect with those workers is crucial. And if you're only talking English in Toronto, you're missing out one hell of a lot of members, and you've got to be able to have an approach that engages members where they start from. And the third part is the alliance policy. The labor movement cannot succeed anywhere in the world, and not in this city or anywhere else, without a strong commitment to an alliance policy. And the alliance policy is about working patiently, generously, with allies in the community, in non-union workplaces. Our key allies in the Toronto Labour Movement are people like Workers' Action Centre that we're allied with the minimum wage and other fights, ACORN, the Federation of Students, a number of immigrant organizations like the Tamil Congress, Chinese Canadian National Congress, Jamaican Canadian Association, and others. Some of the social justice groups who've came in and assisted us in the cleaners fights, the Migranti and migrant justice organizations, and the environmental movement and environmental justice. I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two, but those are some of the key allies that we have worked with over these years. Some used to be strong allies and are no longer a significant force, like the women's movement. There's not really a powerful women's movement in Toronto today and Canada today, and those are some of the challenges we've got to rethink. So those are the three elements of a plan. Actually creating the plan, having the right analysis, and having an implementation process and checking up that it will be implemented, and saying to each union, in our case, when have you started the discussion? How have you mapped up the membership? Who's talking to them? Please report back. Please let's have accountability to each other. If we're undertaking a fight to take on a common challenge, we need to be accountable to each other. And I got to tell you, that's pretty goddamn tough. In my position, as I pick up the phone and talk to union leader after union leader, or executive boards, or stewards, I find the resistance, I find the hesitance, I find people unsure of how to start that. And it's really important. And the reason we've created these kinds of documents here that talk about, this is a discussion conversation. The reason we've actually chronicled what did we hear when those 840 people who were trained up to be campaigners in the workplace, what did they hear and what was the feedback? We chronicled that so people could see it. So if people are getting afraid to do it, they can look at that and say, okay, it's not only us, it's not only my workplace or my union that has problems in moving this forward. Other people are saying the same thing. And we've also realized that we have to connect this fight to the broader conservative agenda and the broader agenda of capital, which is a low-wage economy. And in the center spread of this newsletter, you'll see how we're trying to create connecting the dots to the attack on unemployment insurance, to the abuse of the foreign temporary worker program and the horrific exploitation of those migrant workers that are coming here, of the attack on seniors on the OAS, of the attack on labor law, of the privatization that's continuing. Connecting those dots is really crucial. So we actually created a website called lowwageeconomy.ca. And in the fall, we're going to unroll, some popular stuff with stickers that says, want to know what the Conservatives' plan is? Lowwageeconomy.ca, and you go to that website and you see some of that stuff. March 2nd, we had 720 people in. We trained them up. We asked them to go back in the workplaces. About a third of them came back a month later and reported what they had heard. The good, the bad, and the ugly of what they had heard in the conversations they tried to do. In May, we trained another 120 people. We've been asking those unions to go out. And this month, the CLC is finally unrolling the national campaign across this country. They call it Together Fairness Works, bringing together union leaders in 17 regional meetings. The one in Toronto is on September 28th. And we have decided that even though some of that national rollout isn't maybe everything we've wanted, we think it's important to integrate because, this stuff can happen from the top down, but it has to happen horizontally as well, and that's what happens in peer relationships based on our city and our movement locally. Finally, I'm going to raise an issue which I think is really the topic of tonight. What's the role of the left in all of this? What's the role of people who are conscious, who have an analysis in taking this fight against the offensive by global capital, the offensive by Canadian capital, trying to undermine and reduce our capacity to do both collective bargaining and political bargaining, to protect the social wage we've won and those social equity advances we've won for our communities, and to protect rights of workers and standards of workers. How does the left consciously, as individuals and as networking, move this forward? When I got into the movement, it was a time in the 70s where all the baby boomers were coming into the workforce. It was a huge left tradition that was part and parcel of, there wasn't a single union in Toronto where you weren't having people that had training about political activism standing up and saying, are we going to do this? I have to tell you right now that I see very little of that being reflected when the leaders of our unions come together and talk about what's got to be put on the table. There's not the pressure from their own membership to say, let's deliver something. And that is the role of the left. And I think that's part of the conversation we'll have as people break into small groups. Thank you very much.
Welcomed. to Sonia Singh. She's an organizer with the Workers' Action Center, a worker-based organization that's committed to improving the lives and working conditions of people in low-wage and unstable employment. Sonia's currently working on the campaign to raise the minimum wage.
So I'm going to build on a lot of what John has sort of already laid out. Thank you, John, for setting that stage. I was asked today to talk about what the impact of these kinds of right-to-work proposals or anti-union proposals have on precarious workers more broadly. And I want to start with that sort of framing that John ended with, that we can't see an attack on unionized workers as separate from an attack on non-unionized workers, that this is all part, that this is all interconnected and it's part of a larger low-wage agenda that includes what John has mentioned, the expanding of temporary foreign worker programs, so where workers are denied access to basic protections that we all count on and don't have status, so are coming as temporary migrant workers, changes to EI that are pushing more and more workers into low-paid, precarious jobs, and the broader deregularization of labor standards, the rolling back of employment standards enforcement, and cuts to social assistance. So I know at the Workers' Action Center, we've taken a lens where all of these kinds of changes are completely connected, and that the alliances that we're building need to be addressing all of these efforts to roll back basic protections. So we see this newest wave of right-to-work proposals as just another attempt at breaking down our solidarity. And so in terms of looking at precarious work, again, I don't think I need to outline what the trends are in this room. I'm sure lots of people both are living these trends or reading about it all the time. But we know that just as John has mentioned, this is more urgent than ever. The study that was released earlier this year by McMaster and the United Way found that just in the last 20 years, precarious work had increased by 50%. So this is a pace that is moving very quickly, and it's not giving us a lot of time to think of strategies. We have to be moving now. What we see in our work at the Workers' Action Center, so for those of you who don't know our organization, we're a worker center that's based in Toronto that works with mainly non-unionized workers with an information line, providing support on workers' rights issues, but also organizing to try to increase standards, improve enforcement of basic rights, and most recently around increasing the minimum wage. So what we see at the Workers' Action Center is that one way of, from the calls that we're hearing, from the trends that we're seeing every day, a way to understand precarious work is increasing levels of exclusion. And so what that means is that employers are finding more and more ways to ensure that basic protections that we once could count on are increasingly being rolled back, or finding new ways to get out of those protections. So whether that's people working like the Toronto Courier's local is dealing with being classified as independent contractors, where entire sectors are now not considered employees. So Couriers is one example. What we see at our center are almost every single cleaner who calls us on our phone line and who's not a unionized worker is being classified as an independent contractor. Almost every single painter who calls us. So these are entire sectors of work where people are not considered employees. So never mind having access to union protection, even though there certainly are unionized jobs in those sectors, for workers of color, for new immigrants who are coming to the city and finding these low-wage jobs, access to a union is just not happening. It's also, exclusion is also around what some authors have called the gloves-off economy, where evasion and erosion of basic standards is the norm. So that means in Ontario, less than 1% of workplaces are inspected for employment standards violations. So you can imagine the scale and the spread of violations when the risk of getting caught is less than 1%. It also means exclusion. So when we're talking about migrant workers, the fact that agricultural workers do not have the right to a minimum wage. So that is still our basic law that is based in a fundamental exclusion. And in fact, so talking to Chris Remsrup, who some of you may know from Justice for Migrant Workers, tonight about this talk, and just thinking around this kind of anti-union framework and how we could kind of connect it to migrant work, he raised, I think, a really insightful point that essentially migrant workers are already living in a right-to-work regime. Agricultural workers, whether they're migrant workers or not, although we know that there are hardly any non-migrant agricultural workers anymore, do not have the right to organize. They can form associations, but they do not have the right to bargain collectively. And most other migrant workers effectively do not have any access to this right as well. That's not counting the access to basic standards and access to employment insurance. So when we want to see what would the impact be of these kinds of initiatives rolling out in Canada, all we have to do is look at some of the conditions that migrant workers are facing right now, the dangerous working conditions, the deaths that we see year after year, the low wages that never have any opportunity to rise, the lack of any voice at work. Not to, again, go into examples that I'm sure people have heard, when we think about what are the impacts, the OFL has done research where states in the United States that do have right-to-work policies, I'm just going to keep using that language for simplicity's sake, and then we'll switch. We'll find the new language in the discussion. We know that in those states, workers earn lower wages, are less likely to have benefits, and are 60% less likely to belong to a union. So this is a massive effect that we are extremely concerned about, because it's already obviously incredibly difficult for people who are working in precarious jobs to exercise their right under the Labor Relations Act to form unions. The act was written in a time when large workplaces, the same work location, a direct relationship with your employer, long-term employment, this was all the norm for some segments of the labor market. Of course, we know for many communities, for women, for workers of color, for immigrants, precarious work has been a reality for a long time. But those conditions no longer are the case for the majority of us today. And so these kinds of changes would make it even more difficult to address the challenges that workers face to organize in their workplace. It just adds one more layer of exclusion. I think another really important point, and just building on what John has mentioned, is that a critical role that unions play is to allow their members to pool their economic resources to be able to carry out, to fund political advocacy and social movement and community work. So this support is often very critical for grassroots groups that would have no other access to funding. And as we're thinking about new organizing models, that support from unions is critically important. So I think the impacts of being less able to generate that kind of funding and support social movements would have a ripple effect that would affect all of us. And I think the last point is that in any part of the labor market, of the working class, reducing voice, reducing collective power in our workplaces makes all workers feel less confident about standing up. And we already see today the incredible fear that exists for even just filing an employment standards complaint. At our work at the Workers' Action Center, I could probably count on two hands the people that I've worked with in the last 2 years who have made a complaint while they've been on the job. Every single person only is comfortable speaking up even about getting minimum wage or getting overtime once they've left work. So how we raise that level of confidence, how we address that fear of reprisal that is a very real fear is a huge challenge for us, and something that would be even greater if these policies were to come into effect. So thinking about how we respond to these kinds of attacks, I think it's really important to, again, building on what John said, to think about all of these interconnections and how we build a fight back that connects all of those different levels, all of the ways that we're working on these issues, and recognizes the urgency of this, that this is the moment, we don't have another moment, we need to be looking at what are new ways to organize, and I know that the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, that is a huge part of the work that you're doing. So looking at challenging exclusion, essentially we look at how do we build power for migrant workers, for precarious workers, but for workers across the labor market. And the Workers' Action Center has been one alternative model to look at that. It's just one model, and we need to look at more models. Look to the states at the worker centers and worker organizing that's happening often in very powerful sector-based movements. So just today, the domestic workers organizing in California just yesterday won a major victory by getting their Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights passed through the California Senate. This is a huge victory that, again, in California, domestic workers did not have access to basic rights and protections. This is following on the lead of incredible organizing that happened in New York State. And we can see from some of these models that there is lifting up standards from the bottom up and building alternative membership bases, alternative ways to work with workers who effectively don't have access to protection and to especially union protection. At the Workers' Action Center, the way that we've come at it is to look at just that. How do we raise standards? So we've looked at different ways to update basic employment standards and have had some victories around temp agencies, around fees and live-in caregivers. But as I mentioned before, a huge focus always has to be just ensuring that the basic law is enforced. And that has been the focus of a lot of our work, of our Stop Wage Theft campaign. Looking at migrant work is also critically important. So John mentioned migrant worker organizing. The Migrant Workers Alliance for Change is a really important alliance that has come together of both union, community, faith, and migrant workers themselves to, again, look at how do we raise standards, how do we ensure that migrant workers are coming not as indentured workers who are tied to one employer who can be sent home at the whim of that employer, but with status like every other worker, like our ancestors who came here to Canada. I think I wanted to just close around the minimum wage because I think this is a focus, a demand in particular where the potential to build alliances between unionized workers and non-unionized workers is really great. And it's also a place where getting a win on the minimum wage is a way to really show what we can build working together. That we can fight back against this attack, that we can win an increase that would affect 750,000 workers in the province of Ontario. And so when we look at who is earning minimum wage, we know that this number is increasing. It's not just young people. The majority of workers who are earning minimum wage are not young workers anymore. That of course there's an increased number of women and immigrants who are earning minimum wage. But we also know that a lot of unionized workers are not necessarily earning minimum wage, but are earning under $14 an hour. And $14 is the demand that the campaign has put out because that's the amount that brings you just 10% above the poverty line. So I think we have to be comfortable of acknowledging that we can be winning gains in our workplaces, not just at the bargaining table, but through community alliances, through employment standards. Lifting those standards affects all of us. And I think that's where unions can play an incredible role in community movements to fight poverty wages. So a lot of labor councils have been taking on that fight. So the Toronto Labor Council was really integral to the campaign that won a $10.25 minimum wage last time, and now is part of the coalition that has been launched this year. But how do we broaden that? If, as John says, there's can be resistance at top levels, how do we start from where we're at? I think there's a real role for rank and file activists to be taking this campaign on, to be looking for ways to build networks within your unions that are so important to building that fight back that we'll need on so many levels, not just around minimum wage, but on all of these different areas. And I think that finally, just moving beyond minimum wage, looking at what are the organizing models that are going to work in this new context. So it's really inspiring to see what the Couriers are trying to do with the support of CUPW. Looking at what are the legislative changes that we might need to bring in more different kinds of bargaining. So whether that's going back to discussions of what would sectoral bargaining look like, the models that carpenters and painters have currently, how could we expand that? How could we address some of the barriers that precarious workers face? And I think that where at the Workers' Action Center, our philosophy is we have to kind of start where we can. Win victories, workplace by workplace, New protection by new protection, it may be a long haul, but we have to build that collective confidence that together we are able to build power, we're able to build dignity and respect in our workplaces. And so want to just invite everyone to, if you can, get involved in our minimum wage campaign. I'm going to pass out on Saturday. We have an action that is taking place outside of Dufferin Mall for those in Toronto. Just to give a bit of background, the coalition has now is happening in many different cities around Ontario, and there was a decision to take actions on the 14th of every month until we win a minimum wage increase. So August 14th was the first province-wide day of action, where there were over 12 cities that participated. So September 14th, this Saturday, is the second day of action. And this day of action we just launched today on our website, so we encourage you to take a look and help spread some of the materials that are there. This day, we wanted to expose who is behind the corporate lobby that is keeping wages low in Ontario. So when we look at who are the main lobby groups that are calling for a minimum wage freeze, who are calling for a lower minimum wage for inexperienced workers, that's the Retail Council of Canada. Who are these nameless, faceless bodies? And what are the brand names that are sitting on those executive boards? So that's why this day of action on Saturday, we've chosen 3 targets who sit on those corporate lobby executive boards: Tim Hortons, McDonald's, and Toys R Us. So again, in I think it's going to be 14 cities, people are taking action outside of those 3 targets, saying, if you say that you support our communities, as of course all of their corporate jargon does, then you'll support a minimum wage that brings us out of poverty. And the broader message is to Kathleen Wynne to say, we don't buy it. We don't buy the corporate lobby. Are you going to stand with them, or are you going to stand with us? So we invite all of you to come and help us share that message. You can either come on Saturday, or if you visit our website, which is on here, there are different tools. There's a tweet and email action to Kathleen Wynne. There's a graphic on Facebook that we're hoping to get shared as much as possible. So please help us spread the word and come out on Saturday. And also think about the next 14th, October 14th, if there's something that you'd want to organize. It's a very decentralized campaign, so people, even in Toronto, there's another action taking place at Jane Finch, a Jane Finch street party against the minimum wage. So our vision is that every month the actions expand, and neighborhood by neighborhood in Toronto, people are doing things, city by city and community by community, it's growing every month. So if you have any ideas, we'd love to hear them. Thanks.
And also Sam Gindin. Sam is the former research director and assistant to the president of the CAW. He's an author, a former York prof, and an activist with the GTWA.
The Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly has been around 139 years less than the Toronto Labour Council. I want to approach this a little different.
How old are you, Sam?
I actually want to talk soberly about the weakness of the labor law. Not just the attacks on it, but talk soberly about the weaknesses as a starting point for recognizing what we're up against and how radical the changes we're going to have to go through are. First of all, in terms of this right to work for less, however we want to shorten it, program, I think what's interesting about it is that there isn't a general, this is the moment in time when labor is so strong that they have to attack us. I think that the reason we're actually being attacked at this point in time is because of our weakness, because they can. It makes it a different kind of an issue. I think there's also the political issue that Sonia raised that I think is very important. It's less about limiting us in bargaining, which they've been, isn't as if we're making all these great gains, but one of the impacts of getting rid of something like the rent formula is that it would completely block the unions, given how isolated they are from their base, from actually engaging in wider political campaigns. And I think they're quite conscious of that it would make it very difficult for unions to organize for things beyond their immediate interests. And what that raises is that what we have to talk about is not just the attack on us that might make us weaker, but how weak we already are. Now, Tracy raised the fact that one of the arguments about why we're so weak that's made on the left is that the very legislation we're trying to defend, the RAND formula, is part of the problem. That because of the RAND formula, the labor movement ended up turning to very legalistic solutions, administrative solutions, moved away from mobilizing. It isolated the leaders because you had automatic dues collection. I think there's some truth to that. But I think the better way of thinking about it is that there's always been a contradiction in the labor movement. We're trying to win things within the system. And trying to win reforms in the system has meant that workers have fought for how you actually stabilize your organization, how you get some legal protection, how you get a solid financial base. So we've had to live with this contradiction. And the question isn't how to get rid of the RAND formula, because unions do need those resources to be able to stand up to capital in some way, but how do you live in an environment where you're dependent on the state to some extent, where you're institutionalizing the organization, but at the same time retain enough independence so that you can actually mobilize. I think there's also a more fundamental problem in the labor movement than that. And that is that the labor movement is a sectional organization. It organizes particular groups of workers to represent their interests. And often, as John had said earlier, these are workers who just happen to be there. They weren't involved in organizing the workplace. They came and there was a union there. Their political views are all over the place. Now, the problem with having an organization that's basically sectional, that's really just representing a particular group of workers rather than have some vision of the class, some vision of developing workers' capacity so that you can transform society, is that it tends to become instrumental. And what I mean by that is it tends to say, well, what are we getting from this organization? We're paying our dues. What are you doing for us? And as soon as you have that kind of a relationship between the union and the members, it means you're very vulnerable to bureaucracy. And that, I think, is a much more serious problem for the trade union movement. And what it means is that the question for us isn't how do we restore some militancy. It's actually how do we change what unions are. The point about the kind of model that was sectionalist and you could just be militant and care about yourself was that it worked in the 50s and 60s. It worked at a particular moment in history, and the gains that were made were actually spread to some extent. But that model doesn't work anymore. We're not even able to defend ourselves anymore. And that raises this question of not just restoring militancy, but what does union renewal actually mean? Okay. Now, the other thing this raises is if union renewal is the real issue, and I think that's the real issue. If we can't get union renewal, we can block them from getting rid of the RAND formula, but then we're still in the same ship that we've been in before. I mean, we really have to take seriously how severe this defeat has been. You know, part of it is everything that Sonia raised. Why is it that the trade union movement hasn't been able to move into these new sectors? This is a real limit on us. We take a look at bargaining. Unions are bargaining two-tier wages. What are two-tier wages except unions deciding that some of their members will be second-class citizens in order to save something else? We're negotiating precarious work, essentially. One of the things that's really happening everywhere right now, and it isn't talked about very much, is what's happening to workloads in unionized workplaces. You talk to nurses, you talk to anybody in the public sector, you talk to anybody in the private sector. It's not just wages, but it's what's actually happening to their life in the workplace. Teachers as well. And then there's the very crucial defeats that we're having that I think are also much more important than what's been happening to wages and benefits, is what's happening to people's social programs, what's happening to the school system, what's happening to the environment, the fact that we haven't been able to actually get childcare on the, seriously on the agenda. These are profound defeats. So, if we were really talking about the question of the renewal of the labor movement, one of the questions is, would we start off with a campaign based on defending the RAND formula? Is this what we would want to go into the workplace to talk about? Because I suspect a lot of our members would say, it's very nice that you hear now that the union's finances are being hit, but where were you when they were squeezing us in the workplace or taking away our jobs? Now the reality is, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I'm using that to kind of just warn that if that's the limit of what we're going to go into the workplace with, we're going to get killed. So what we do in the workplace has to be directly linked to labor renewal. It has to be linked to convincing workers that the union is a space for struggle, that the union is a place that is actually serious about rethinking all its structures. So this question of rethinking all the structures I really want to emphasize, because I think John raised a lot of things about what campaigns mean and what we have to do, and I think they're really excellent. I think the Labour Council in Toronto has probably done more on this than any other Labour Council in North America. It's very impressive. But what we have to recognize is that if we're really going to make these things happen, it almost means a revolution inside unions. Unions are not structured to do these things. If you really want to suddenly do this kind of mobilization, unions don't have the capacity to talk to their members. You have to think about, what does the staff do? Is that what we want them to do? How should the staff be retrained? How do we allocate all our resources in the union? What does the research department do? Should the research department be working with the Workers' Action Center to really talk about those kinds of alliances, or checking out what General Motors is doing? What should it be doing? How do we do all of that? How do we relate to the community? I mean, these are really serious questions, and the barriers to overcoming them are really profound. They're really difficult to do. Okay. So the question is, what would such a discussion look like? What would we do if we really wanted to change these? And again, I think that Sonia and John really flag these things. The first thing is that we have to have the widest possible discussion in our unions about the crisis in unions. That's what we have to start with. Not just the attack on us, but the fact that there's been a crisis in our unions, and we have to begin that kind of a discussion. And we have to form committees in each workplace. Hopefully that the unions themselves will form these committees. They're the ones who can do this right now. But if committees aren't formed, then that's something that that labor activists on the left should be pushing for. You should be fighting in each of your unions to say that if we're facing this kind of a struggle, let's set up committees that actually begin to organize for these things. The kind of education we have to do is, a lot of it is basic skills that we've lost. In addition to what John raised, one of the really terrific things that the Labour Council's put out is this booklet, and there's a fatter campaign booklet called Achieving a State of Readiness. It's superb in terms of actually thinking strategically about how you mobilize and how you make connections with the workers and how you plan, and giving workers the skills of actually strategizing. It's excellent. But in addition to that, we have to actually take class seriously. And class, again, it doesn't just mean that we pronounce that we actually care about social services and we're interested in everybody, or that we want alliances. If we take class seriously, it changes everything about what the union is. It doesn't just mean we have this division between politics and bargaining. It means that we actually have to think about, at the bargaining table, putting political demands right there, like the Chicago school teachers did. Something that the public sector has to think about. If the public sector wants to convince people that it actually stands for the class, that it's a leader in the fight for social services, it can't just pass resolutions. It actually has to take the risk of putting these kinds of things on the bargaining table. And once you do that, then you have to think about, well, what would it mean if we actually strike on these things? How do you strike against the public when you're saying they're on your side? And it leads to thinking really creatively about how you engage in workplace action and in strikes in a way that reflects class. That's another kind of discussion. It means that when we talk about organizing, and we talk about our failures in organizing, we recognize that they're not technical failures, that we are not going to organize all the people that Sonia talked about. There's 85,000 public care workers in this province, the fastest growing sector. These are low wage, women, immigrant women generally, women of color, increasingly also from Eastern Europe, because wherever there are crises, women from there are going to end up having these jobs. It's the fastest growing occupation in Canada and the United States. To try to imagine workers actually cooperating to do this is impossible to imagine. Because to cooperate, you actually have to say, our goal is to build the class. Our goal isn't just to get members for ourselves and get their dues. And we're very far from that kind of a class perspective in terms of organizing. So I think that what John said about the weakness of the left is absolutely fundamental. I'm very skeptical about this happening. I think it's terrific that we see the labor movement talking about this. It leads to all kinds of openings. But I think that the changes involved are very radical. I'm very skeptical about the changes actually taking place. Until there is actually a left that can play the kind of role that John flagged, I think we should absolutely support the idea of setting up these committees in the workplace that start mobilizing and talking to members and strategizing. But again, I think those are going to have to be things that are fought for. I think activists have to fight for those things. I think activists are going to have to come together and have spaces where they can strategize amongst themselves across unions and across workplaces. And we're hoping that that's the role that the Labor Committee of the Assembly can play, where we actually train people, where we actually strategize about the limits of what the unions are doing, where we actually provide material that might go further than what the unions are interested in doing because of limits of the leadership or limits of their connection to the NDP in terms of a class analysis. So I think those are the kind of things we can do. And I don't see these things as being against the labor movement. I think that where we can support the labor movement doing this, we should obviously do it. But where the labor movement is slow, we should push them. And where it's not doing it, we should start organizing rank and file workers to do it themselves. Okay, I guess I just want to finish with one thing. I think one of the crucial things we have to build, and it's something that the Labor Committee of the Assembly has been thinking about, is if we really are thinking about class as a critical issue, that this is a critical thing to bring into our mobilizing, then we have to create structures that reflect class. We can't just say go back into your workplace and organize workers there. We have to think of a way, of a form of organization that brings workers together across workplaces. And the Labor Council, to some extent, does that. I think that what the Assembly can do is it can define class in such a way that it isn't just the unionized working class, so we can bring inside our own organization people who aren't unionized, and we can raise issues in the community directly there, and that we aren't limited, but I think a lot of the politics that goes on in the labor movement, both in terms of divisiveness, because of territory, and because of also the kind of limits that revolve around social democracy and being nervous about certain kinds of issues because they might limit the party electorally. Okay, thank you.